Welcome to the construction video of my Gentry Custom Boats Chuckanut 12S skin-on-frame kayak. This video illustrates the steps that I took to build the boat. This is my first skin-on-frame kayak. I hope you enjoy the video. The first step was to rip some western red cedar that I used for the chines, gunwales, and keel, or stringers depending on what you call them. The western red cedar was not the best choice, but it was cheap and available. I would rather have used spruce or white pine. The Gentry plans provide templates for the bulkhead frames. I traced the frames onto some half-inch plywood, then cut them out with my bandsaw. I used a high-quality 2x4 piece of wood to act as a strong back, bolted to my workbench as a place to secure the keel while I attached the frames. I just screwed the keel to the strong back. The bow and stern pieces were cut out of half-inch ply, then glued and screwed to the keel. I used some scrap plywood to help hold the frames square to the keel. I used epoxy glue to attach the frames to the keel. The Gentry plans provide exact locations for the frames, but in reality, it's not mandatory to be exact with their location. You will notice that all frames have a center line marked on them. These will be important later on to help square up the kayak. Prior to the installation of the chines, the frames and keel wig around a fair bit and are difficult to keep square. Don't worry too much about it. This will be fixed later on. I inserted the first chines into the frames and used straps to hold in place. I did not glue anything yet. I pulled the chines together at the bow and stern and used clamps to hold them in place. I used a fine saw to cut the chines so that they flared nicely into the bow and stern. I got better at this as I went along. I should have probably practiced these cuts on some scrap first to get the angles correct. I added the remaining chines and gunwales. Once again, just clamping to hold in place, no glue yet. I moved the hardback and kayak frame from the workbench to some sawhorses. I bolted the hardback to the sawhorses. Lots of clamps and straps were used to hold everything together. I ran a string from the center of the bow to the center of the stern. This string provided the reference line to square up all the frames. I laid some temporary pieces of wood across the gunwales and then laid level on them. Getting these temporary pieces of wood level is key to squaring up the kayak. I checked the level and string at all frames, adjusted the clamps and straps as necessary to get things aligned. I used a wax thread, purchased from Amazon, to hold the chines, gunwales, and keel to the frames. There are several great videos on YouTube on how to do this. I use very little glue to hold things together. Most of it is waxed thread. Use a scrap piece of wood to pull the thread tight. This will save your fingers from a lot of abuse. I used a combination of glue and thread to hold the chines to the bow and stern. The wax thread has proven to be very strong and reliable. After 3 seasons of use of the kayak, I have not had any failures of the thread. The cockpit frame, called the carlin, was a bit of a challenge. There is quite a bit of a bend in it. To get this bend, I had to cut a bunch of saw cuts into the carlins, about an inch apart, to help bend it into shape. I could have soaked the wood in hot water as well to help assist in the bending. Plywood triangles are glued in place to help hold the carlins together. I made some small mounts out of 1/8 plywood to hold the foam flotation blocks. I glued these to the chines. I stained the float mounts before installing the foam. I cut the foam blocks to shape with a homemade hot wire. I built radio control models, so I'm quite familiar with cutting foam with a hot wire. I used 2-sided carpet tape to hold the foam blocks together and onto the plywood mounts. I decided to use the wax thread to secure the blocks to the plywood mounts. I made a tool out of a dowel to feed the thread through the blocks. I followed the instructions and made the seat floor out of 1/8 plywood strips attached to pine blocks. These strips are tied to the blocks with wax thread. Full disclosure, I used the seat only a few times before I broke it. Later, I used a sheet of 1/8 plywood attached to these blocks and have not had any issues with it. The thread, applied in a figure-8 format, held the strips to the blocks, but provided some flex when you sit in the seat. This picture is from the underside and shows the pine blocks that are attached to the plywood strips. Notice that the blocks are not attached to the keel, rather just rests on it. I did stain all the wood. I'm not sure it's necessary, but since I saw the kayak outside for much of the summer, I figure I should make it as waterproof as possible. I cover the kayak with 9-ounce polyester fabric. Once again, I watched several YouTube videos before attempting this. The kayak is covered with 2 pieces, one for the bottom, one for the top. You lay the fabric on the kayak and smooth out any wrinkles in the fabric. Once again, clamps come in handy to hold things in place. I use stainless steel staples to hold the fabric to the gunwales. Place them about every inch. I found this tool at Home Depot and used it to stretch the fabric. I put some tape on it to add some grip. I secured the fabric to the bow and stern with clamps. Rather than use a knife or scissors to trim the fabric to shape, I used an old soldering iron to melt the polyester. This worked real well. At the bow and stern, the fabric is stitched together. I used the wax thread along with a big needle to pull the fabric together. It's a simple running stitch, nothing fancy here. Double back on the stitch, then roll up the remaining fabric and sew in its place. There's a fair bit of trimming and pulling to make this happen. Take your time on this. Once complete, it looks like this, simple and waterproof. Flip the kayak over and use the same process for the top. Overlap the gunwale and pull the fabric tight. Once again, staple in place. Opening up the cockpit area was a little nerve-wracking. Cut but leave at least 2 or 3 inches extra to staple to the carlins. Staple the fabric to the carlins and then trim. Once secured and trimmed, you will still have a few wrinkles in the fabric. Take a household iron set to medium heat and shrink the fabric. I should have measured the temperature, but I forgot. I did create a small test frame to try this on some scrap before I started. You should be able to shrink out all your wrinkles. I decided to use latex house paint to finish the kayak. I was not sure if this would work, so I took my test panel, painted it, and then set it outside for a month, and then checked it out. It worked great, no leakage or peeling. I used Benjamin Moore exterior latex for my color coats, semi-gloss finish. I used a latex primer to fill the fabric and did a light sanding prior to color coat application. I used a smooth, short bristle roller to apply the paint, dark blue on the bottom and light blue on the top. I used 3 light coats of paint to finish the kayak. The cockpit combing was next. I made a template out of cardboard first and then cut it out of 1/8 plywood. I clapped it into place and then secured it with stainless screws. I installed some pine strips to act as rub rails along the seam between the top and bottom. This covers the staples and gives the kayak a finished look. A bit of varnish on the combing and rub rails finished off the kayak. All up weight was 34 pounds. It is easy to lift up onto my Ford Escape for transport. I test floated the kayak at a local pond soon after the ice melted. To my surprise, it floated and had no leaks, so I slid into the kayak and went off for a paddle. Well, this is the first kayak ride in my new home-built kayak. So it seems to be floating. I'm in Pond Mills Lake. And yeah, paddling so far, no leaks. This is awesome. Well, I've been around the pond once. The boat seems to be handling fine. Yeah, paddle's okay. Not very tippy, quite stable, exactly as the instructions said. And still no leaks, so very impressed. have used the kayak for 3 seasons now. It has proven to be a great little boat. It gets great comments wherever we paddle. I have only had to touch up the paint a bit where it is rubbed off on some rocks. The fabric has not had any holes, despite running over logs, rocks, and other underwater obstructions. All in all, a great project.